How many pints would you have during a fairly tense game?
Oh, depends. 5 or 6 pints or like that.
I mean, even when you're on the television?
Yeah.
How can you see the board?
It's a funny old game.
It's a funny old game.
Picture this, it's primetime TV in the late 70s. Millions are watching, and the stars of the show are throwing darts with one hand and holding a pint in the other. Cigarette smoke clouds the stage, beer glasses line the table, and somehow this was considered the height of professional sport. But what looked like pure entertainment on screen would eventually get darts banned from television, and the reason why is as wild as the era itself. In the late 70s, when darts exploded onto British television, it didn't look anything like the polished tournaments you see today. Instead of sports drinks and fitness regimens, players walked onto the stage with cigarettes dangling from their lips and pints of lager sitting next to their scorecards. Crowds weren't polite or restrained either. They were rowdy pubgoers transplanted straight into living rooms across the country, cheering loudly, chanting, and laughing as their heroes took aim through a haze of smoke. For millions of viewers, this was pure entertainment. You weren't just watching a competition, you were watching a culture. Darts came from working-class pubs, and TV didn't try to clean it up. In fact, the spectacle leaned into it. The cameras zoomed in on players sipping beer, commentators joked about the drinking stamina of certain stars, and the whole atmosphere gave darts this rebellious charm that no other televised sport had. But beneath the laughs and the spectacle, there was something darker brewing. To outsiders, darts didn't look like a professional sport at all. It looked like a drunken night out. Players were literally competing while under the influence, sometimes downing pint after pint mid-match. The idea that this was being broadcast to families on primetime TV quickly started to bother critics, who saw it as less of a sport and more of a bad example. Still, in those early days, nobody could deny the appeal. Stars like Eric Bristow and Jockey Wilson became household names, not just for their skills on the board, but for their larger-than-life personalities. They weren't polished athletes, they were pub legends. And that was exactly why fans tuned in. The image of a dart player casually lighting a cigarette before throwing a double 20 is something you'd never see in modern sports, but back then, it was part of the show. And yet, as the sport's popularity grew, so did the questions. Was this sustainable? Could darts really hold its place on television while looking more like a smoky pub than a serious competition? The cracks in the facade were starting to show. The rise of darts on television was as unlikely as it was meteoric. For decades, the game had been tucked away in the back rooms of smoky pubs, a pastime for regulars who knew each other by name. But in 1973, everything changed with the Indoor League, a Yorkshire television program hosted by Fred Truman. Suddenly, a pub game was being beamed into homes across Britain, and people couldn't get enough of it. By the late 70s, the British Darts Organisation, or BDO, had organised the first World Championship, and broadcasters like the BBC and ITV quickly realised they had a hit on their hands. Millions of viewers were tuning in, often more than for football matches. Darts had transformed from pub entertainment into a primetime sensation, and its stars were becoming as recognisable as footballers or cricketers. And it wasn't just the competition that kept viewers hooked. The atmosphere was unlike anything else on TV. The characters were larger than life, with nicknames, swagger, and a kind of raw authenticity that other sports simply didn't have. Eric Bristow, the crafty Cockney, strutted on stage with supreme confidence, while Jockey Wilson's unpredictable antics made him a fan favourite. They weren't athletes in tracksuits, they were pub heroes in polyester, and that's exactly why people loved them. The strange part, the things that would eventually destroy darts' reputation were, at the time, its biggest selling points. The smoke-filled venues, the pints lined up on tables, and the players visibly drinking mid-match gave the sport a dangerous charm. It looked like the pub down the street had just been handed a national spotlight. But, as the audience grew, so did the scrutiny, and soon, the very things that made darts popular were the things that put it in jeopardy. But what viewers didn't see on TV was even more outrageous, and it would soon come back to haunt the sport. If the stage looked rowdy, the backstage scene was pure madness. Players were known to drink heavily before and during matches, not just a pint or two, but sometimes several beers just to steady the nerves. It wasn't unusual for competitors to head into world-class finals, already buzzed, and cigarettes were practically a second accessory. The line between sport and night out blurred completely, and for many, that was exactly the point. Some players even admitted later that alcohol was part of their routine. It calmed the shakes, gave them confidence, and, for a while, seemed to improve their accuracy. But while it might have helped their nerves, it didn't do much for the sport's image. Rumors spread of players turning up late to matches, staggering onto the stage, or barely able to finish games because of how much they'd been drinking. The wild behavior didn't stop at alcohol, either. There were stories of backstage fights, rivalries turning bitter, and sponsors starting to worry about how all this looked to a national audience. For fans, it was entertainment. For critics, it was chaos, a circus dressed up as a sport. And then came the media. Comedians and satirists had a field day, portraying darts players as overweight men with cigarettes in one hand and pints in the other. The most infamous sketch came from Not the 9 O'Clock News, which mocked darts as the sport of drunken buffoons. It was funny, yes, but it also cemented a damaging stereotype that stuck with darts for years. For broadcasters, the joke hit a little too close to home. Sponsors didn't want their brand tied to this image. Families who once watched darts together began to see it as an embarrassment. And by the mid-80s, the cracks that had started backstage were spilling into the public eye. By the late 80s, the fun was over, and the sport's wild image would cost darts its crown on television. By the mid-80s, darts was fighting a battle it didn't even realize it had already lost. What had once looked charming and rebellious was now starting to feel outdated and even embarrassing. The British media began tearing into the sport, mocking it as a pastime for overweight, chain-smoking drinkers rather than serious athletes. That Not the 9 O'Clock News sketch might have been played for laughs, but the damage was real. It created an image of darts that was almost impossible to shake one of beer bellies, cigarettes, and slurred interviews rather than professional competition. Sponsors who had happily thrown money at the sport during its boom years suddenly grew hesitant. Brands didn't want to be linked with scenes of players puffing smoke between throws. Even broadcasters began reconsidering whether darts was fit for primetime television. By 1988, both BBC and ITV had scaled back their coverage, and fans who were once guaranteed to see their favorite players on national TV suddenly found the sport disappearing from their screens. And this wasn't just about image, the numbers were falling too. Ratings that once rivaled football were slipping, and without the big audiences, TV executives saw little reason to keep darts in their schedules. The sport that had once been untouchable was now struggling for survival. Players themselves were caught in the middle. For the stars of the game, darts wasn't just a pastime, it was their livelihood. But as the criticism piled on, they could see the writing on the wall. If the sport didn't change, it was going to vanish from television altogether. And so, in 1989, the most controversial rule change in darts history was introduced, and it shocked everyone who had grown up in the drink and smoke era. In 1989, the British Darts Organisation finally pulled the trigger. For the first time, alcohol was banned from the stage at the World Championships. Players were no longer allowed to nurse pints mid-match, only water was permitted, and cigarettes, once an almost comical part of the sport's identity, were banned soon after as well. For many, it was the end of an era. The images that defined darts, the smoke curling around the stage lights, the clink of pint glasses as players took aim, were gone overnight. Fans who had grown up with that rowdy atmosphere felt like something essential had been stripped away. Players themselves were split. Some admitted it was necessary if darts was ever going to be taken seriously, while others grumbled that it was destroying the very culture that made the sport unique. But the decision wasn't about pleasing old fans, it was about survival. Broadcasters made it clear, if darts wanted to return to television in any meaningful way, the game needed to look like a professional sport. The days of beer-soaked interviews and chain smoking on camera were over. From now on, darts would be presented as something closer to snooker or cricket, disciplined, respectable, and family-friendly. Of course, change didn't come easy. Players who had spent their careers relying on beer for confidence had to adapt. The sport had to rebuild its reputation almost from scratch. But even as these bans were rolled out, trouble was brewing behind the scenes. A growing group of top players felt that the BDO wasn't doing enough to secure new sponsorships or TV deals. They didn't just want bans, they wanted a whole new future for darts. And when the breakaway finally came, it turned into one of the most bitter splits in sporting history. By the early 90s, the bans had cleaned up the sport's image, but darts was still in deep trouble. TV coverage had collapsed, prize money had dwindled, and many of the top players felt betrayed by the very organization meant to protect them. The BDO, once the powerhouse of darts, seemed unable or unwilling to adapt quickly enough to the modern sports world, and the stars weren't willing to wait around. In 1992, 16 of the biggest names in darts decided they'd had enough. Eric Bristow, Phil Taylor, and other top-ranked players broke away from the BDO to form their own rival organization, the World Darts Council, later rebranded as the PDC. Their goal was simple: to restore darts to television, secure sponsorships, and present the game in a way that could appeal to a new generation of fans. But this wasn't just a quiet split. The BDO responded with fury, banning the breakaway players from competing in their tournaments. Legal battles erupted, the two sides fought bitterly for control, and darts became a sport divided right down the middle. For years, fans were forced to pick sides: the old BDO or the new PDC, as both organizations scrambled to survive. And yet, against all odds, the gamble paid off. The PDC secured a long-term deal with Sky Sports, introducing high-production broadcasts, dramatic walk-ons, and a presentation style that treated darts like a full-blown spectacle. Crowds were encouraged to sing, chant, and create the same atmosphere as the pub days, but now it was controlled, polished, and camera-ready. The sport was reborn, not as a relic of the smoky 70s, but as a modern entertainment powerhouse. But even as darts soared into a new golden era, the memory of its wilder past never fully disappeared. Today, if you tune into a major darts tournament, you'll see athletes in sharp shirts, laser-focused under bright stage lights. There are no cigarettes curling smoke across the cameras, no pints stacked up on the stage, no half-drunken interviews after the match. It's professional, it's global, and it's profitable. In almost every way, the sport has succeeded in shedding its old image. But the drink and smoke era still lingers in the public imagination. For some fans, those chaotic years remain the most authentic version of darts: raw, unfiltered, and completely unique. Stories of players downing beers mid-final or lighting a cigarette before throwing a winning double are passed around like legends. They're a reminder of a time when darts felt less like a sport and more like a piece of working-class culture beamed onto primetime TV. At the same time, the bans and the split proved one thing: darts couldn't survive if it stayed trapped in its old ways. Without change, it would have vanished from television altogether. Instead, it evolved, rebuilt, and became bigger than ever before. And that's what makes the story so fascinating. The same chaos that once made darts a national obsession nearly destroyed it. But by tearing itself apart and starting fresh, the sport saved itself. The drink and smoke era is gone forever, but its legacy still shapes darts today as a warning, as a memory, and as a reminder that sometimes the wildest stories come from the unlikeliest places,